So, there's this kid. And this kid really wants a new Xbox for Christmas because, Xboxes are fun. And his mom has heard him talking about this Xbox in tones of awe, explaining all the great things about it, and just talking about how cool it would be to have one. And she's heard this for a few weeks, and so then a few weeks later, she's going out Christmas shopping. And she sees one in the store, which is a rare thing for one of the new game systems to actually be available in a store, but she sees one, and she picks it up. And she imagines the smile on his face when he receives it. And now this Xbox is not a cheap gift. It's an expensive gift. And honestly, for this family, it's going to be somewhat of a sacrifice to spend that much on one gift. But she really wants what's best for her child, and she knows that he will enjoy it for a long, long time, so she buys it. And she gets it for him, and then Christmas morning comes, and the boy opens the gift. And he sees it, and there's a joyful shout and a tight hug and dozens of frenzied thank yous. And he's just excited about this gift. And she smiles. Mom smiles because of the smile on his face. Such a wonderful thing. It was worth every penny just for this moment. And later that day, she stops by his room a couple of times and watches him as he's working on setting it up and getting it ready, and then playing these games with utter concentration. And then she asks him a question about the game, and he responds with, "Wait, can't talk. Just can't talk." He's just kind of, that's it. And then he seems to forget that she's even there. So a few days later, she looks up, and he's standing next to her chair. She's flipping through a magazine or whatever, and he starts to tell her about some of the add-ons and some of the other games that are available and that his friends have, and how their version is so much better than his. And if only he had these add-ons or these other games, then he could be happier and play with them. And it would be just wonderful if he had these extras. And then a few weeks later, she's noticing that he doesn't seem to be around as much as he was before. She doesn't see as much of him. He's busy playing his game. And she also notices that he really seems less content and less happy than he was before she bought this console. This gift that she got him has become an obsession, and that obsession is tearing him down. How could such a nice gift go so wrong? Now, it happened because the gift became more important than the giver. The gift was not in itself wrong or evil. It was simply a source of pleasure. But when the gift became more important than everything else, it became an idol. It became a god. And when things that bring pleasure to our lives become more important than the God who gave us life, they become a god of pleasure. Now, we're in week 2 of our series, Gods at War, and we've been talking about the things in our lives that we allow to become more important than God, and how they war for control over our hearts and our lives. And today we're going to be talking about the gods of pleasure. Now, how does something become a god of pleasure in our life? And I think, as the story I just mentioned illustrates, I think a lot of times it starts with a gift. A gift that brings us enjoyment or pleasure, a gift that ultimately is given to us by God. James 1:17 says, "Every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." Enjoyment and pleasure were things that actually God created us to experience. He created us for those things. The ability to enjoy and find pleasure in things was something that was put in us by God. That was a gift that God gave us. But then, because of our sinful nature and the sinful nature of the world we live in, we start to seek enjoyment and pleasure more and more. And it becomes an obsession for us. And so then we begin to seek out the things that bring us pleasure and enjoyment. We begin to reach for them and desire them more than anything, and then those things quickly become the center of our attention. Then the desire for the things that bring us enjoyment and pleasure begins to have authority over our lives. And we devote ourselves to experiencing and having those things that bring us enjoyment and pleasure. They become an idol. And without even realizing it, oftentimes we are worshiping the gods of pleasure instead of the God who created us to experience pleasure. Now, as we think about these gods of pleasure, they show up in our lives. They show up easily. There are probably one of the worst idols that we have to deal with on a day in and day out basis because, like I said, God created us for pleasure. God created us to experience and enjoy things, to have good things. But then sin has gotten in the way of that, and sin has perverted that. And then because of sin, as I said, these things become more important than God himself. And as we're thinking about these things, I think there's some things we need to understand about how God reacts when we worship a God of pleasure. Now, the first thing I think we need to understand is that God will not bless his competition. In 1 Kings 16, we see the kingdom of Israel gets a new king, King Ahab. And King Ahab, in terms of following God, was the worst king in the history of Israel. He, as it says there in verse 30, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. But why was he the worst? What did he do that made him so evil? A little later in next few verses kind of tell us that he married a woman who was the princess of a foreign nation, from a foreign nation, and then he began to worship her gods, the gods that she worshiped, he began to worship. And then he allowed her to have many of the prophets of God executed, which I think is an interesting thing when we step back and think about people who really seek pleasure. Is one of the things they do is they also really seek to get rid of the people who are telling them that they're doing something that is dangerous or bad for their lives. They seek to push those things away. And that is what Jezebel had done. She had her God. And she didn't like these people telling her that it was a false God, that it wasn't a real God. And so she had them executed. And then King Ahab even went as far as building a temple to her God, the false god Baal, in the capital city of Samaria. Ahab allowed worship of a false god to enter the nation of Israel, and as a result, many of the people were led astray. That is why the Bible calls him the most evil of all of the kings of Israel, because he allowed the people to be led away from God. But God is a jealous God. And God got to the point where he had enough. 1 Kings 17:1 says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word.'" God was going to bring a drought to the nation of Israel. And this is a big deal. Nowadays, we experience droughts here. We have experienced one this summer, but our smart people have managed to breed corn in such a way that it can still grow even in drought conditions. And there's still things that we're able to do to still get our food source even in the midst of drought. But in these times, they didn't have that sort of thing going on. If there was no rain, there was no food. And drought led to famine almost every single time. And so, but God was bringing a drought. And this is important to understand because the god Baal was originally thought of as the god of weather. He was the god of weather. So by withholding the rain, God was withholding his blessing in the very area where the Israelites had set up a false god. He was basically saying to the Israelites, if you want to worship this false god Baal, let him do his thing. And God withheld it and said, if Baal is the god of weather, he can bring the rain. I will not. God will not bless his competition. And I think this is something that we see sometimes in our own lives. If we put something ahead of God, at first, a lot of times it's like it's enjoyable, it's fun, but then we find this area of our lives being frustrated more and more. The Israelites were worshiping the god of rain, so what does God do? He sends a drought. Now, I'm not saying that God always does this, that God always takes, when we set up these things in our lives, that God then almost like punishes us by withholding this blessing. God doesn't always do that because God is smarter than I am, and he knows better ways of doing things, but we shouldn't be surprised if that's what he does do. He does do it sometimes because God will not bless his competition. He won't do it. A second thing that we need to understand is that God is not going to share his glory. Now, a few years after God sent this drought, God sent Elijah back to King Ahab to set up a showdown. We read about it in 1 Kings 18. Starting in verse 17, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to it, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" I'm going to pause here, and just because this sticks out to me. It's also amazing how when we allow things to take control of our lives, and someone is telling us this is the wrong thing, that we view the messenger as the cause of the trouble rather than the idol that we've tried to put in charge. So that's a side sermon for you. And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now, therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and send 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Elijah just says that, look, you're leading Israel astray. You're causing trouble, just like your father did, only worse. But you have walked away from God. But now gather these prophets of the false god, 850 of them, bring them to Mount Carmel with all of Israel, and we'll see what happens. And so while Ahab's doing that, while Ahab is gathering these prophets, Elijah spoke to the people of Israel. And he said to them, verse 21, "And Elijah came near to all the people and said, 'How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him.' And the people did not answer him a word." Now, the word limping here, and we're going to see it in a little bit too, it's kind of a ceremonial dancing. It implies a dancing with like short steps kind of thing. That's what that word means. And so Elijah is saying here, how long are you going to dance between these two opinions? How long are you going to vary back and forth between them? And why is it that you think the people didn't answer him? Why did they just sit in silence? And I think it's because they wanted both. They wanted this false god, and they wanted the Lord God. They wanted both. Because if they just wanted Baal, they would have just up and shouted, "We want Baal." And if they would have wanted God, they would have said, "The Lord, the Lord." But they didn't. They just sat there in silence. And I think it's because they wanted both. They didn't want to be forced to choose. Instead of having a throne in our hearts where God reigns, we oftentimes ask God to sit on a love seat with another God. We ask him to share space in our hearts with something else. And often it's a God of pleasure that we sit next to God. You know, God is sitting next to a television, or he's sitting next to a tub of ice cream, or he's sitting next to that special website, or he's sitting next to this six-pack. We put God on this love seat and expect him to sit next to this other God that we have. We don't want to choose. Whatever it is that we find enjoyment and pleasure is, we place it right next to God, because just like the Israelites, we don't want to choose, because we get enjoyment out of these things. We get comfort out of these things. We get pleasure out of these things. But God was going to force the Israelites to choose. He was not going to share his glory with another. He told us that much in Isaiah 42:8. "I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I will give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols." He is not willing to share a love seat with some other God when he should be on the throne alone. And if we're trying to have both the Lord God and this God of pleasure, we're going to end up serving one or the other. We can't serve both. That's what Jesus told us in Matthew 6:24, that we can't serve two gods. We're either going to love one and hate the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. There's no in between. We can't serve two masters. And that's the reason, when we look through the book of Revelations, that's the reason that Jesus gave this warning to the church in Laodicea. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot, so because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. That's a pretty harsh warning that Jesus gave them. God doesn't like fence sitting. That's not something that God appreciates or enjoys. He will not share his position. So, and when it comes to these times where we try to put God on a love seat in our lives with this false idol, like, he's either going to stand up and walk away and let the false idol have the throne, or he will bring us to a point where the false idol will bring us to a point where we have to choose. And that leads us to the third point that we need to understand about how God responds to the gods of pleasure in our lives. When we choose God, he will respond to our worship. Now, we go back to 1 Kings 18. So the stage has been set. Elijah has challenged 850 false prophets to come to Mount Carmel and face off with him against this one prophet, the one prophet of the one true God. And so all these prophets show up, and several thousand witnesses all gather near on Mount Carmel, and Elijah lays out the terms of this showdown. He made the challenge. He gets to lay the terms out, and he says, "Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them," the false prophets, "choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on wood and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "It is well spoken." So the people agreed to this. Like, yeah, let's figure out who's the real God here. And I almost wonder if maybe they were kind of hoping that the fire would come down for both of them. so that they could, have their cake and eat it too. They could have both of their gods. But these false prophets were going to take a bull and prepare it for sacrifice. Elijah was going to take a bull and prepare it for sacrifice. And the God that actually lit the fire was the true God. And so Elijah let the false prophets go first. He let them choose the bull. And then they took their bull and started preparing for sacrifice. And then they started calling on their false god Baal. And there was no answer. So then they started dancing around the altar and doing that limping dancing again. And still no answer. So then this goes on for a while, and then Elijah, being the kind-hearted person that he is, starts making fun of them. And he's like, look, he's a god. Maybe he's busy. You got to yell louder so he can hear you. He's probably in the middle of something. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Like, he really says that. And, like, he just kind of makes fun of them, tells them, look, you need to yell louder to get his attention so that he can hear you. And the prophets, they tried. They did their best. They cried aloud, and they started cutting themselves, as was their custom. They started bleeding. And the midday passed, and they just kept going. They kept going until it was the time of the offering of oblation, or the evening sacrifice. But Baal didn't answer. There was no voice. There was no answer. There was no fire from heaven. And, they tried. They really tried. But while this was going on, Elijah asked the people to draw near to him. And he began to repair the altar of the Lord. There was an altar that had been there before, and he began to repair this altar that had been thrown down. He began grabbing stones, one stone for each tribe of Israel, and rebuilding this altar. And then he dug a trench around the altar. He took stones for each of the tribes of Israel, set them up, and then he dug a trench around the altar. And then he put the wood for the fire on the altar, and he prepared the bull. And then he had a bunch of water poured on top of the altar. These big jugs of water poured on the altar so that everything was wet. But then he had the people pouring the water do it a second time and then a third time. So there was so much water dumped on this altar that everything was completely soaked, and the trench that he had dug around it was completely full of water. And then Elijah called on God. And he called on God, and he said, "Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that these people may know you, O Lord, may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." He calls out to God. He knows who God is. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. And he is the God, not only the God over that land, he's the God over all other gods. And he says, "Answer me, God." And God answers. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And we think about, like, Elijah had all this water poured on there, and there was one simple reason for that. Like, with as wet as everything was, there was nothing that they could have done to get that fire going. There was nothing. They could have stuck whatever they wanted in there. It would not burn. But then God, so it had to be a God thing. God was the only one. So God sent down fire from heaven, and it consumed the altar. It consumed everything on it and dried up all the water. And then the people saw God for who he really was. They accepted that he was God alone. They accepted that they had been trying to put two gods on the throne, but there was only one God for the throne. They accepted that, and they worshiped the one true God. And then a little later in 1 Kings 18, we read this. And in a little while, the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. Now, and I did some looking into this, just trying to understand the passage a little bit, like how soon was it after this rain had come? God sent the fire about the time of the evening sacrifice. Ahab went to eat supper. The rain came. So it was that evening that the rain came. God responded when the people worshiped. He refused to bless his competition. When the Israel worshiped the god of weather, God withheld the weather. But when Israel quit worshiping Baal and worshiped the one true God, God responded by restoring the blessing he had withheld from them. Because God responds to our proper worship. And we see this in our own lives when God reveals to us a thing that we've set up in his place. When he reveals to us a thing that we're using to get enjoyment or pleasure or comfort that is more important in our lives than him, when we recognize that and we put that thing in its proper place and put God alone on the throne, God blesses us in that. God gives us the things that we need so that we can serve him properly. Now, it is so easy for the things that we find enjoyment in or pleasure in to become idols in our lives. It is so easy for them to take over the throne of our heart. But we must remember that God will not bless his competition. He will not share his glory, but he will respond to us when we worship him and him alone. Is it possible that something you enjoy has become a god of pleasure that is stealing glory from the one true God? If it has, then we need to deal with it. We need to deal with the false gods that are in our lives. We need to put them away. We need to turn from them and put God where he is supposed to be. We're to worship God and God alone.
Hello, I'm Rich England, the pastor here at River of Life Community Fellowship, and I want to thank you for joining us for our online service today. Here at River of Life, we hope and pray that you've been blessed and encouraged by what God had to say today. If you'd like to know more about our church, we invite you to find us online at www.rolfellowship.com or on social media. We're on both Facebook and Instagram. Just search at ROL Fellowship. Thank you, and God bless.